Okay, AP, good morning. Today, um, as I mentioned earlier in the week, you're going to be doing a quick write on focus questions, but I'm going to give you a really quick chronology so that you can answer the questions related to the beginning of the war. So grab a piece of paper, and instead of making this a separate topic, go ahead and just put steps towards war. This little set of notes will be a little more useful in getting that chronology straight as we get up to Lexington, which we'll be doing probably Monday. So, as you recall, we kind of talked about mostly just the acts up to this point, the laws, what Parliament was specifically doing to the colonies and the colonial reaction to it. We talked about currency, we talked about the Stamp Act. Now we're going to get into a few of the more substantive events. And as I mentioned, kind of that mythical history. You can see the first one on the list is Boston Massacre, when in fact that's a little bit of a misnomer, and it ended up a lot different than we think about it as history. So go ahead and list these events first, and we're going to go through them. And it's going to take us up to that First Continental Congress, which was going to be convened to write the Declaration of Independence. So we've got Boston Massacre, the trial of the British soldiers that were involved, and their lawyer is going to be John Adams. Conflicting views of the event. This is important when we get to these viewpoints in history. If you remember the other day when we looked at the tarring and feathering scene, to the British, that looks a whole lot different than it did to the American colonists. The Boston Tea Party, the Intolerable Acts, and the First Continental Congress. So those are the events I'm going to be touching on as we go through here. I'm going to go ahead and switch slides. Okay, what you are looking at here is a famous engraving you might have seen in 8th grade. This is done by Paul Revere. We talked about him the other day in regards to that whole "the British are coming" thing, when we actually realized that he would not have said such a thing. But this is his engraving of the Boston Massacre, which took place on March 5th, 1770. When you look at a picture like this, you can clearly tell who is the aggressor and who are the victims. If you notice, on the right-hand side, you see a line of redcoats. They are firing. You can see the smoke rising from their rifles. And behind them is their commander, and he's actually raising his sword, which is what they would have done with an order to fire. And if you look to the left, you see the colonists, obviously, that have been shot. They're bleeding, they're being carried away. So this engraving has a clear viewpoint. It's a little difficult to see from my sort of pixelated picture, but if you notice, the caption at the top says "The Bloody Massacre." So this engraving was done, I'm not quite sure how long after the massacre, but that's what Paul Revere did for a living. He was an engraver and a publisher. So as a colonist, he's obviously going to have a certain viewpoint on this event. I'm going to go on to the next slide here. So what actually happened on that night? It was a winter night. It's March in Boston. It's very cold. It was snowing. We know up to this point that the colonists were upset by the British military occupation of places, especially like Boston, which was considered like, a hotbed of trouble. Well, 5 British soldiers were sentries, meaning they were guarding, in this case, a British headquarters. And some people who were, kind of coming out of the pub at that time of night started yelling at them and jeering at them. And there was an accusation that a bunch of people started throwing snowballs at them. But further, when evidence was presented at their trial, they had actually taken rocks and covered them in snow and thrown them at the British soldiers. The soldiers moved into formation. There's not that many of them there. And they were specifically ordered by their commander not to fire on the crowd. But They did. They ended up firing on the crowd. 5 colonists were killed by the British as a result. So this is the event known as the Boston Massacre. It's what we call the Boston Massacre. Now, of course, it's, not wonderful when people are shot, but as Paul Revere presented it, there was no provocation, when in reality there was. The soldiers were, being taunted, which would be okay, except they were also being struck with objects. So that's part of the defense you're going to hear from John Adams when he was there. He was their defense attorney when they were put on trial for this murder. So here you can see the contrasting views a little better. On the left, you see that colonist engraving by Paul Revere. But on the right, you see the British version. And look at the differences between them. First of all, Paul Revere's engraving has a major character missing from it, which was the very first person who was killed by the British, a guy by the name of Crispus Attucks. We'll talk about him in a minute. But the British version, you can see here that the colonists are armed and they are hitting the soldiers. They are grabbing their rifles. As you can see that they're kind of trying to pull them out of their hands. The colonists are rushing at the soldiers. And so soldiers have fired as a result. So you notice the clear differences here. This is why history is tricky to teach and to learn, because of the viewpoints. Somewhere in the middle of these two versions is the truth. So that line I have there at the bottom where it says, without photographic evidence, both sides could interpret the event to their advantage. And that's what's going to happen, of course. This is where the viewpoint of the colonists and the viewpoint of the British are going to differ about this event. So Crispus Attucks, the man I just referenced, is believed to be the first casualty in the American Revolution because he's the first person struck by a bullet during the Boston Massacre. Even though there had been no war declared yet, this event becomes a hugely important one in the minds of the colonists. So they draw the reasons for the revolution back to this event. He was thought to be a runaway slave. He is in several of the engravings of the massacre, but not in Paul Revere's version. We'll talk more about that. I'll show you a version he is featured in. So if you've heard his name from 8th grade, this is just a reminder of who he was. He's considered to be one of the first casualties of the American Revolution. There was a trial for these soldiers. John Adams, who would be the second president of the United States, was their defense attorney. And the trial was in a colonial court, accusing several of the British soldiers involved in the shootings with murder. So this is not the King's Court, and that's different. So the British allowed for these provincial courts to operate. 6 of the soldiers were found innocent of any charges, and 2 were convicted on manslaughter charges and were punished by having their thumbs branded. And if you don't know what that is, we live in an ag town, so we know what branding is. You mark cattle that way, so they burned a brand onto their thumbs. Their captain, Preston, was acquitted because the jury could not be sure he ordered his troops to fire into the crowd. That was the point of contention. So think about this result compared to the engraving by Paul Revere. My guess is that most Americans would say the Boston Massacre was committed by British soldiers on Americans, but they wouldn't even know about this trial where most of these soldiers were found innocent. So it's, again, history is a lot more complex and it takes on this mythical quality, kind of like when we talked about Pocahontas before. Boston Tea Party is another one. This took place December 16, 1773. We know from our discussion of the acts that it was specifically a protest against the importation acts and the fact that Boston was in generally being punished for being this kind of place of real unrest and danger for British soldiers. So this engraving is the destruction of the tea at Boston Harbor. And what you see is obviously crowds at the docks and they are grabbing crates of tea that is being imported into Boston, and they are throwing it overboard. What you notice about the boat in the foreground is that the men are dressed as Native Americans. And this was done on purpose, and we'll talk about that here when we get to the description. So the causes of the Boston Tea Party. Kind of a recap of what we learned, but we'll do that quickly. Parliament had repealed the Townshend Act, but still taxed tea. So if you think back at that chronology we went over the other day, in 1765, they had this Townshend Act, and then in 1766, they repealed it because everybody was in the colonies was freaking out and protesting about it. But the theory for that was that the colonists would accept the tax if they were able to get the tea from the East India Company at a lower price. So there was really more of a competition between corporations here than anything else. The problem is the British East India Company had a monopoly on tea sales. So this was an effort to, quell that monopoly and bring more competition into it. Colonial leaders in Boston protested, and cargoes of tea on ships were held in Boston Harbor until the ships were boarded and they were thrown overboard. Okay. After the tea would not be removed from Boston Harbor, 50 members of the Sons of Liberty, led by Samuel Adams, who was a real person, not just a beer, dressed up like Mohawk Indians and boarded the ships. They threw 342 of those caskets of tea overboard, and it was worth about 10,000 pounds sterling, which was the British currency at the time. We talked about the Currency Act and how tricky that was to equate that to money, but it would be about $1.50 for 1 pound of sterling. You can see on that engraving Americans throwing the cargoes of tea ships into the river at Boston. So the only result of this immediately is going to be the British cracking down on the port of Boston and occupying with more troops, which is exactly what the colonists didn't want to have happen. But it's at this point that the British decide they're going to start to confiscate weapons and hunt down these protesters. Sons of Liberty will become fugitives. And so this is going to lead us up to a couple of years after this, when Paul Revere rides through the night warning people that the quote unquote British are coming, when in fact we know he said that the regulars are coming. And he is warning people that the British are coming for their arms. And that's what we're going to be looking at next, that Lexington and Concord event that happened. Here's an eyewitness account before we finish. This is from George Hughes, who was a participant in the tea protest. In about 3 hours from the time we went on board, we had thus broken and thrown overboard every tea chest to be found in the ship, while those in the other ships were disposing of the tea in the same way at the same time. We were surrounded by British armed ships, but no attempt was made to resist us. The next morning, after we had cleared the ships of the tea, it was discovered that very considerable quantities of it were floating upon the surface of the water, and to prevent the possibility of any of its being safe for use, a number of small boats were manned by sailors and citizens who rowed them into those parts of the harbor where the tea was visible, and by beating it with oars and paddles so thoroughly drenched it as to render its entire destruction inevitable. And I accidentally covered up that last word there, but I read it to you. So what this tells us, more than the fact that the British were brutally cracking down on the colonists, remember, this had been going on for a decade. So the British were actually showing quite a bit of restraint when the colonists were kind of constantly destroying property or protesting or refusing to pay taxes. We saw in that little snippet of John Adams, they attacked and tarred and feathered a British official. So if you look at it from their point of view, these are acts of terrorism against them and their empire by people who are being supported by their empire. So it's very easy to see both viewpoints here when you read accounts like this, because he's basically, the key thing is here, we were surrounded by British armed ships, but no attempt was made to resist us. So the British didn't attack them. We know, of course, the intolerable acts are going to be a result. This is where the British are going to get brutal, and they are going to start cracking down on the colonies and occupying the cities. And they actually closed the port of Boston for a while because of the trouble. This question that I have on the slide says, what do you think is going on in this political cartoon? When I posted it, I didn't realize how difficult it was to see. So we're actually going to do this one on the next set of slides, and I'm going to find one a little better. And by now, we're pretty good at these primary sources and reading these captions, but this one's just really hard to see. So we'll talk about them when we talk about Lexington. And the cursive handwriting in the caption is a little hard to read too, so I will make sure that we get a better picture of that. However, the gist of it is the British are cracking down and punishing the colonies for this protest activity. Purposes of the Intolerable Acts were passed in response to the Boston Tea Party a few months after it happened. They were officially called the Coercive Acts, but they were nicknamed the Intolerable Acts by the colonies. So when you see it from the British point of view, we want to coerce you into doing the right thing. And when you see it from the colonial point of view, we won't tolerate that. So notice even that it's one set of laws, but they're called different things. They were designed to punish Massachusetts until the tea destroyed in the Boston Tea Party was paid for, which I don't think it ever was. This is another one I'm going to post for you on on Google Classroom. But if you look to the left at the caption on that picture, the Bostonians in distress. So Boston was on lockdown, and if you notice, they're tied to something called the Liberty Tree, and there are other colonists there attempting to help them. And if you look in the very background there, you see the British soldiers like standing in a line at the harbor. And what this is showing is that the British are carefully guarding that harbor. What they're not really paying attention to is Boston's influence on the other colonies. The word of what's happening in Boston is spreading to places like Philadelphia, other major colonial cities, are going to start helping their comrades in Boston. Okay. The laws that were considered intolerable acts from the viewpoint of the colonists, I want to focus just on those top two. We've talked about them. The Boston Port Act closed Boston Harbor until the tea was paid for. And the Quartering Act, very important one, it forced the citizens of Massachusetts to house and feed the British soldiers in their homes. This is a big one. I referenced it before. And it's going to be so intolerable to the colonists that when it comes time to form the Constitution, they actually add this to the Bill of Rights. The Third Amendment to the Constitution says you cannot be forced to house soldiers in times of peace in your home. So that was a big deal, you know, in the 1770s and 80s, although that doesn't really happen too much now. Okay. Lastly, I have this stupid QuickTime thing that was supposed to play on here. I don't think it's going to, but let me see. No, it is not, so I'm just going to talk about it. Another result of the Boston Tea Party, of course, is that the whole colony is placed under martial law. In martial law, military authority takes the place of civilian justice, meaning that even though the king had allowed colonial courts, colonial judges, now under martial law, everything is military. So strangely enough, if the Boston Massacre had taken place later, there may not have even been a trial about it. So to sum up here, I'm going to put up these focus questions. Here's what I would like you to do. You're going to open the doc that I've listed on Google Classroom. I will put these questions in there, even though I know you've seen them before. And you can edit just like you did before, just answering them as you go through. You absolutely can use any or all of the notes that you've taken. and they're pretty general. What are the main events that lead to the declaring of independence? You're going to go up to 1775 because that's when we get to Lexington. You don't have to mention Lexington. We haven't gotten there yet. Number two, how did the acts cause resentment among the colonists? I want you to think back specifically to when I talked about the acts and the reaction of the colonists. And then number three, how did the Boston Tea Party and Boston Massacre really occur? And here I want you to focus on the differences between what we thought they were versus what they really were. For example, when you talk about the Boston Massacre, mention that trial and how it probably would have turned out differently. Okay, I'm going to pause here